And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Hi there, I'm National Weather Service meteorologist Peter Chan with your Alaska Marine Weather Outlook on this Saturday, November 30th, 2024. And we'll start out with the sea ice. The ice continues to grow. It's extensive throughout the far north along the Beaufort Sea coast, dropping down along the Chukchi Sea coast. Still some open water, lower Chukchi Sea through the Bering Strait. That'll try to fill in here in the coming days with just the colder temperatures that'll be in place. There's a pretty good area of Arctic air over the central and western interior that's going to be pulling offshore of the YK Delta tonight as northeasterly winds increase out of Norton Sound and along the YK Delta. We find the ice now expanding to about Nunavik Island here and then down into areas of Kuskokwim and Bristol Bay, and also up into the far north end of Cook Inlet, Turnagain Arm, Knit Arm, those areas. But again, the ice will have a tendency to be expanding west and southwestward here as we go through the early week due to this colder temperature. So late tonight into Sunday morning, the leading edge of the Arctic air pushing out here toward the central Bering Sea, the core of it still back here over the southwest interior areas of the Yukon-Kuskokwim Basin. And low pressure here in the North Pacific is pumping moisture northward along this frontal boundary. That's why there are winter storm warnings for heavy snow central northern panhandle. Juneau, Gustavus could see 612, 614 inches of snow. Further south here, Prince of Wales Island be more of a mix. Could see a period of light freezing rain until temperatures warm enough to just plain old rain during the day on Sunday. Meanwhile, in the far north, Arctic high pressure rains from eastern Russia across the North Slope into northwest Canada. And for Sunday afternoon, that frontal boundary creeps northward a bit. That's why the snow will persist central northern parts of the panhandle, especially along the inner coastal mountains. And then back to the west, that colder air continues to slide toward the southwest, toward the central western Aleutians. By Monday afternoon, this frontal system will weaken, but there's going to be another front come up from the North Pacific. This is the next low, and there's a front just south of the screen that'll be expanding northeastward with another round of precipitation impacting areas along the Gulf Coast by Tuesday. This low being induced by that push of colder air coming across the Bering will keep areas of light snow or snow showers and some mixed precipitation mainly along and south and west of the Aleutian chain. So winds on Sunday, 35 knot southeast gales, waves up to 14 feet, Dixon Entrance here outside of Metlakatla. In the central northern channels, Stevens Passage up to Lynn Canal, north winds 30 to 35 knots, waves 6-7 feet. The outer coast, southeast winds to 30 knots south of Sitka, but then Sitka on up through Gustavus, we're looking at gale force winds 35 to as high as 45 knot easterly gales out of the icy Strait corridor with waves 9 to 10 feet. Monday, those snow should diminish a bit. But winds still hold up in places. Southeast gales of 35 knots or gusts there within Stevens Passage and certainly down through Dixon Entrance. Waves could be as high as 7 feet Dixon Entrance. And as we get up through Lynn Canal, north winds to 25 knots and 5-foot waves. For the outer coast, south winds as high as 35 knots west of Craig and 35 knot winds out of the icy Strait corridor with waves 8 to 9 feet there. And along the northwestern Gulf, pretty uniform northeasterly winds of 30 knots from Kayak Island outside of Hinchinbrook Entrance to along the Kenai coastline. Now for middle lower Cook Inlet and northeast of Kodiak Island, look for northeasterly gales of 35 knots with waves 9, 10, even above 12, 13 feet there outside of Kennedy Entrance. And Monday winds will come down a bit. Northeast winds 10 knots across Prince William Sound, 2-foot waves. For the outer coastal areas as we get from outside of Hinchinbrook Entrance along the east side of the Kenai Peninsula, 20 to 25 knot northeasterly gales, still 30 knot winds within Anchor Point, off of Anchor Point in lower Cook Inlet with waves of 7 to 8 feet. And then northeasterly gales, Shelikof Strait on Sunday up to 40 knots, 11-foot waves, 35 knot gales out of the northeast east side of Kodiak Island with waves as high as 14 feet. As we go down along the Alaska Peninsula, winds will turn more northerly. Cold Bay Faults Pass at 25 knots with waves 3 to as high as 8 feet north of Cold Bay and generally 5 to 8 feet on the North Pacific side. Winds on Monday will generally be east-northeast, strongest within Shelikof Strait at 30 knots, 8-foot waves there, but then east-northeast winds along the length of the Alaska Peninsula, 20 to 25 knots, waves 5 to 7 feet North Pacific side, 4 to 5 feet from outside of Bristol Bay down to north of Cold Bay. The Aleutians, pretty uniform winds on Sunday, generally northeast to east winds 30 knots, and they become a little more easterly once you get west of Adak up through Kiska and Shemya. And then for Monday, as that colder air pushes across the central Bering, it induces this low pressure. So north winds on Alaska, Dutch Harbor, variable winds, Nikolsky 10 knots, turning northwesterly, Atka to Adak at 15 knots, and then picking back up out of the north, 20 to 25 knots, especially Adak through Kiska and Shemya on Monday. Along the west and southwest coast on Sunday, strong northeasterly offshore flow, 25 to 30 knots, especially out of Norton Sound down along the lower Yukon Delta. That ice is in place, will be building with the colder temperatures. 35-knot gales, St. Matthew, 12-foot waves. Northeast winds 30 knots with waves 10, 11 feet around the Pribilovs. And then for Monday, northeasterly winds, offshore flow continues 20 to 25 knots. With ice in place from Norton Sound down along the lower Yukon Delta into Kuskokwim and Bristol Bay. Still northeasterly gales to 35 knots around St. Matthew. And then as we look at the far north, the Bering Strait on Sunday, northeast winds 20 to 25 knots, as high as 30 knots on the north side of St. Lawrence Island around Gamba, waves 5 to as high as 9 feet. Notice the 30-knot winds out of Norton Sound. As we come up through the Chukchi Sea, east to northeast winds 15 knots, and they flip around from Utqiagvik to Kaktovik. Look for southwest to west winds 5 to 10 knots with plenty of ice along the Beaufort Sea coast there. And then on Monday, still west winds 10 knots, Kaktovik, but east-northeast winds around 10 knots. Prudhoe Bay, new exit toward Utqiagvik. And those easterly to northeast winds run around 20 knots off of Wainwright Point Lay, and then pick back up northeasterly winds through the Bering Strait there at Wales, 25 knots with 5-foot waves, and then as high as 35 knots on Monday on the north side of St. Lawrence Island with waves as high as 6 to 8 feet.